If you could just turn on your cameras or indicate otherwise via the chat that you're present, that would be great. Awesome. Welcome to the ESL Finals of the Manchester IV 2021. My name is Matt. I'll be chairing this round and I use he, him pronouns. With the caveat that you ought to address the panel as a whole, as we will be adjudicating you as a whole, I'll now give the opportunity for my panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Jewel.
Hi everyone, I'm Jewel, she or her please, but yeah, refer to the panel as a whole. Thank you.
Hi everyone, Shulipto here, no preferred pronouns. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Umar. My preferred pronouns are he.
Hi, I'm Vladimir. My pronouns are she.
Cool. Just a couple quick housekeeping notes before we get underway. I'll be keeping time in the chat to signal the beginning and the end of protected time. Please indicate prior to your speech how you would like POIs offered, and please respect speakers' preferences in that regard, whether it's the chat or verbally or something else. In terms of points of information, they do constitute an integral part of the game and engagement, so please do offer and receive them as they are weighed within the round, and this tournament being online does not absolve you of the duty to engage. Lastly, before we begin, this round is being recorded and will be streamed. If any speakers who don't want their speech to be recorded, please message Tyler Bryce in the Zoom chat directly, or message in the chat now. We'll be giving just a minute to opt out of that, with, of course, the note that if you have your speech recorded and later on don't want it to be posted, you can opt out and withdraw consent at any time. So we'll give just a moment for speakers to either privately message or message in the Zoom chat that they'd like to opt out of being recorded. Great. Looks like we've got all teams consenting, which is cool. Then without further ado, I will now allow the speakers to introduce themselves, starting with opening government. Who's speaking first?
Mitja speaking first, no preference. I will also change my name.
You're speaking second, your name, please.
For opening composition, Vladimir speaking first, no preferences.
Alek speaking second, no preference.
Chris speaking first, no preference.
And Mehdi speaking second, no preference.
Cool. And closing up?
Yeah, so
Lior speaking first, no preference.
And Tamar speaking second, no preference.
Awesome. With all that out of the way, if there are no further questions, I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister to open up the debate on the motion that stands in their name. Hear, hear.
Thank you very much. I would like to take POIs in the chat if possible. Okay, so starting in 3, 2, 1. Okay, panel, 3 points of clarification before we start the debate, and then two points of analysis on why OG is the right side to support in this debate. So first, about characterization about terrorist groups. Terrorist groups, we characterize them in this debate as being pretty evil, pretty awful. We characterize them as not respecting human rights, not respecting the Geneva Convention on Warfare, and we characterize them as willingly execute in a spectacular manner these soldiers that they captivated, as for example, ISIS or Boko Haram. I think this is quite a fair characterization. And now 2 points of characterization and also preemptive negation towards any opposition team. So first, why does the military have this right to do this and to infringe somehow the agency of the soldier and somehow indoctrinate them into making suicide? Notice the soldiers has already give up their autonomy at the moment when they joined the army. They decided that they are willing to die and to fight for the army, and therefore the autonomy was already given away before joining the army. Therefore, this point would not apply in this debate. And second point, why in the current status quo, despite terrorist groups being so evil and being so nasty towards these soldiers, I will speak this later, why the soldiers do not commit suicide? We believe that human self-preservation forces people to make irrational choices in times of stress, and therefore they choose not to commit suicide even though they have the opportunity and even though they rationally know that they are going to be tortured, and their death is going to be televised. Okay. To get this clear of the way, if there are any clarifications POI, please take. I will take them now. Okay, I will take Alek.
Acknowledge a principal difference between dying and killing yourself, and if you will, what is it?
First of all, I don't acknowledge any principal difference between dying and killing yourself. For example, as soldiers, when they fight, if they have to, for example, keep the enemy at bay for just 15 more minutes so that their other soldiers can escape, they are willing to do so even if they cause their death, and they are expected to do so even if they die. So I don't see any principal difference between that and suicide. Okay, get this out of the way. And now why it is good for soldiers to commit suicide in the case they get captured. So first, on the military perspective, 2 points of analysis. One, soldiers, from the soldiers' perspective, what is the alternative? I think both teams can agree on this. The alternative is not committing suicide, is to be tortured, to be killed in front of the camera. This is quite bad. And therefore, this point on the process of the soldiers, it is actually rational to commit suicide in this position, because obviously an easy death is preferable to being tortured. Second of all, from a military, no, thank you, I will take CO later. But second of all, from a military perspective, from a more general military perspective, soldiers being tortured are then likely to give out intel. They are likely to give out important information that is going to lead to the death of more soldiers, that is going to lead to military insuccess, that is going to prolong the conflict, and therefore the military has an incentive to avoid this. So 2 points of why the military has a good incentive to teach the soldiers this, and why it is rational to do so. But now another impacts, but I will take CO if they have anything.
Given that their alternative is torture or being killed in public, why is it that soldiers do not commit suicide today? And who are the soldiers who we are going to indoctrinate tomorrow?
This was already responded in the first, in the characterization of the debate. I think the judge already have this on the floor. Okay, so the main idea is people don't make always rational choices under pressure. Okay, but now on the perspective of the society, why is it bad that we allow terrorist groups to have captive soldiers that are alive? 2 points of analysis. First, the most simplistic one. Well, what the terrorist groups are going to do? Terrorist groups are going to kill them, torture them, and televise this, for example, as ISIS has done in the past years. Why is this bad? First of all, it projects power. It shows that to others that the terrorist groups is powerful. It can punish and kill British or American or Jordanian soldiers without anybody intervening. And therefore, this is a way of cutting support to the local population and worldwide by showing, look, we are powerful, we are a threat to the global American hegemony, and therefore you should not underestimate, and therefore you should support us. But now the second point of analysis, and I think this is really the hill opening government wants to die, it is a much more nuanced type of societal harm that this causes. First of all, notice that these killings are extremely gruesome, and they're going to have a strong impact by the average viewer in a Western world. And what is the impact and what is the association of the in the Western world is that, oh, look, this is what Islam does, or oh, look, this is what these immigrants that come from Syria want to do to us. Notice this is not far-fetched. This is exactly what has happened when we see that with the rise of ISIS, also there was a rise in Islamophobia in Europe. What is the problem with this? The problem is that with the rise of Islamophobia, Muslim minorities in European countries are going to feel threatened and are going to get more radicalized because they are going to see as radicalization as the only way out, as the only ones accepting them in the current status quo. What's the impact of this? The impact of this is that we get stronger terrorist groups that are able to cater to disenfranchised minorities in rich Western countries, and therefore we get stronger terrorist groups, and that's it. So to recapitulate, because from a military perspective, it makes sense to do so because it spares the soldiers from a gruesome death. It saves precious intel that's going to save possibly the lives of many other soldiers, and because this television of torture of gore is going to lead to more terrorists, to terrorists getting more support in the long run, and therefore leading to more deaths and more gruesome wars, we support the motion. Thank you.
Great. I thank that speaker for those remarks. And now to open up off bench, I call upon the leader of opposition. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Yep, very clearly.
Okay, I'll begin a bit. I prefer questions in the chat. Oh, okay, I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. Honorable panel, several points in my speech. First, some 4 responses to what OG had just said, and then I'll be moving on to our substantive material. Now, firstly, about the OG and their societal harm that will be arise with xenophobia. Notice that xenophobia is not contingent entirely on this motion. There are many other reasons that it exists, for example, racial prejudices, but also if it's about killing people, different groups killing people. Notice that in their world, those groups are again the reason why those soldiers in the first place have committed suicide. So we don't believe that this will actually change something, and the societal harm that they defend is going to be somewhat different. Secondly, they take how terrorist groups by televising these killings and etc. Projects power. Well, this can also happen on their side, they can televise the suicide. But secondly, they do not project power. They do not get more support because of this. They actually get more hatred from other people because they see, look, they have killed our citizens, we have to avenge for that. So we don't believe they those terrorist groups get any support. Thirdly, they say how soldiers will probably give intel and lead to more death for other people. Notice the torture is often very inefficient. Firstly, you can give them unproven information or just information that is false. Secondly, those soldiers are trained to not give this intel as much as possible, and if they do, they can they know that those the army itself knows that those people have been captured and know that they can change, for example, their location, because those soldiers, for example, they can give up their location, but now they know they have been captured, can relocate. So we believe it is very torture can be efficient, but it's mostly inefficient. So we don't believe it that's much problem. If it is, we believe that the principles still stands much higher, and I'll explain it further in my speech. Fourthly, they say how they don't have rights. They have lost their autonomy the moment they have entered the army. There is no difference between being murdered and killing yourself. We believe there is, because in order for you to give up your autonomy, you actually have to consent to giving up your autonomy in the first place. We believe that this is something that this just doesn't happen, because some bit of frame here, because notice how will the state indoctrinate this well, will probably be inherently coercive, because the state will want to undersell it for you. They will just present it to you. You die for your country, you die for not giving up information, you die for for the sake of your country, and they have perceived practical benefits from doing that, and they want you to do so, but you don't have the full information, you don't have the ability to make full consent. And we believe this is one of the reasons it is a war crime. So basically it's not proper consent, because if you get captured, this is certain death. In the military, you consent to the potential death. For example, you consent to potentially being killed in the field, for potentially getting caught up in the fire, for potentially being struck by a bullet. You do not consent to certain death. This is the difference between holding up people. I'll get your POI in a bit. Holding up people and potentially having the potentially being threatened to die. This is the example that OG gives. We believe that in this case of killing yourself, this is certain death is going to happen, and this is something you do not consent to. So that is the difference between this and some suicide missions where you consent to this certain death. There we believe it is okay. This is not this the same case here. Secondly, it is literally dehumanization. You cannot torture, in order for you to kill yourself, you make the active decision to kill yourself, meaning you're actually making the decision to abandon your identity, which is dehumanization. We believe this is a war crime, and this is a difference between there's a difference between killing yourself and dehumanizing yourself and getting murdered, because when you're getting murdered, you're a human until the end. You're not stripping away your identity. But when you kill yourself, you actively make the decision, I'm no person anymore, I'm stripping away. We believe this is coercive and like dehumanizing like this. And thirdly, notice that there's a difference between like being aware that you can get killed, being aware that you can get killed, but because you know that this is like pain, you can imagine this pain, but you cannot imagine what is happening for you to kill yourself. You can probably imagine the physical pain, but you cannot imagine the emotional pain you can undergo when killing yourself. This is something you have never been able to experience, and you're never able to do that until you actually like kill yourself. So we believe that you cannot get this full you cannot comprehension of what it's like, both because you don't like consent to the certain death, but also because you cannot just imagine yourself, and especially when the state undersells it to you, especially when it presents you, yes, you feel good when you do so, you feel like you're defending your country, you don't have the full like ability to comprehend that. I'll get close.
Yeah, so would we prioritize the life of one person or the life of 100 person?
Notice that what we prioritize in here is like not coercing people themselves. We believe that something you're saying about like prioritizing the lives of 100 people is when you're not giving up intel. I have already responded to that giving up intel will not, like in the most cases, inefficient. We believe that it's much more like possible for this to like us to prioritize the lives of those soldiers who have been captured. Why? Because this is just happens really few times. Because notice that most terrorist groups do not take prisoners; they deploy hit and run tactics, like in most situations. And if they take prisoners, they straight up execute them. So we believe it happens really rarely, and we believe it's in very few cases that we have to debate this. In the very few cases in which we would not have to like literally make people kill themselves. So even if it happens very few times, we believe that practicalities and the like practical outcomes still their drawbacks, because notice that the signaling that exists is very, very bad. And firstly, people just don't like this. People don't want to kill themselves or see others kill themselves because it literally clashes with religion, clashes with personal views, and etc. And the possibility of happening is literally worse than that. And notice that when they have this idea, when they have the idea of certain death, that they have to kill themselves, which is entirely different from the potential of being murdered at some point, means that the possibility of happening is literally worse than that. And you will not enter the military to fight terrorist group, which tends to be the place where the military is actually necessary. So even though this happens really rarely, those situations of like soldiers being captured is really rarely by terrorist groups, we believe that there is a certain death, and this is a certain death, you know it is certain, and you still see that as a potential, like a big red flag for you to not enter this like army. So we believe what this leads to is literally less resources to combat terrorist groups. And like this way, when there are less resources to combat terrorist groups, you just incentivize the state to do like conscription or just have heavy coercive propaganda for people to join that army and to like combat those terrorist groups, which further strips their choice and limits their ability to consent, which is our like what we want in the first place. We want those people to be able to consent to the like stripping away their like rights that OG wants to say. People, in order to do that, they need to know what is happening. They need to know what they're going to experience. We believe those soldiers do not consent to that. Hence, the principle just doesn't stand. For all those reasons, I'm so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Great. I thank that speaker for those remarks. Now call the DPN. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep, very clearly.
Cool. Sec. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Dear panel, we believe that autonomy in general is a great good, but we believe that opening opposition fails to recognize the unique circumstances in which these soldiers are. We think that there are specific fundamental preconditions for autonomy being important, and we think that these preconditions are not met in the current case. We think, therefore, that it is justified to take away soldiers' rational decision making, or their decision making, which is probably not going to be rational anyway, because it creates, first of all, a better situation for themselves, and secondly, they have also been consenting into making their own autonomy dependent on the general impacts on the country they are serving. I'm going to explain 4 points on the principle, and then I'm going into the general effects, responding to the quite flimsy rebuttal we get from OO, and also building that a bit more in case CEO wants to build an extension out of that. So first, the principle. So we think that the question is, when do we value autonomy? We think there's 2 specific reasons why we think that soldiers, specifically in these situations, we shouldn't value their autonomy as much. We think, first of all, the general reason why we value autonomy as a moral principle is not because it's just some abstract thing, as OO seems to think, but rather because autonomy is a useful principle to abide by, because people generally know best what is good for themselves. We think, therefore, autonomy only makes sense if this precondition, i.e., the person being the best judge of their own situation, is being met. Note that we also take away people's autonomy in other situations when we judge them to not be the best judge of their own situation. For instance, in cases where someone is suicidal, but we know that this is only the cause of a mental illness, we protect them against killing themselves. We think this is exactly the opposite, where an irrational desire to keep alive is probably the only thing that makes these soldiers not kill themselves in the first place. Why do we think this is the case? Because note that we don't think that anyone could reasonably prefer a death in which you actually suffer tremendous physical pain over a prolonged period of time, over a swift death where the physical pain is almost absent, probably. So we think, therefore, that so opening opposition says, yeah, but there's psychological pain, and you can't actually compare these two. We think there are certain good reasons why we think that the physical pain is probably worse in our side than the psychological pain. First of all, it's not true that you can imagine the physical pain. Like, no one has gone through being burnt alive, right? So we think both of these you cannot imagine beforehand. But secondly, and more importantly, we think the physical pain is just much more longer temporarily, because these terrorist organizations have an incentive to create as much fear as possible by drawing out the execution over a longer period of time, whereas if you kill yourself, you're probably going to do that efficiently. Therefore, if we do not know which pain is the worst, surely it is better to minimize the pain as much as possible. We think any rational person would agree that this is the case, and therefore, insofar as these soldiers don't choose for this themselves, they will be irrational, and therefore we need to protect them against themselves, because in this specific case, their autonomy doesn't function as it should. We also think that dehumanization is also probably going to be worse on our side of the house, right? Because OO says, yeah, autonomy is the most important part of being human, without really explaining this. We think there's many other features that we think are very important for human dignity. One of them being not a means by savage people to actually teach a lesson over the over your own bodily autonomy, right? We think literally being captured and tortured is an enormous assault on your human dignity as well. So we think that probably taking your own matters into your own hands is going to be a worse assault on your dignity, because at least you now have a certain kind of agency where you do not make yourself entirely a means to the ends of illegitimate actors. Even if in the case, even if the human dignity would be clashed, I think still the suffering theory makes it so that no soldier could reasonably not do this unless they have bad irrational decision making. But oh yeah, and then they say something about religion. We think that's probably okay. So first of all, you can consent to go into the army. So if you're religious and you know that this is something you never want to do, you cannot go into the army. They say, yeah, conscription. But even in countries that have conscription, not all soldiers are being sent to the front line, right? You still have to consent to be specific in that division that is going to be sent to the front line. So we don't think this really stands anywhere. Also, religion simply isn't proven. We think it's also illegitimate in terms of autonomy for a soldier to choose certain pain over an unproven assumption. Again, we think this is a bad use of autonomy. But even if you don't buy any of this, even if you don't think that this is in the interest of the soldier themselves, and therefore autonomy doesn't matter for that reason, there's a second reason why autonomy doesn't matter. But first I will take closing.
After these soldiers are dead, whether by execution or by suicide, how does their home country go about getting them back?
Yeah, thank you very much. So this is the second reason. So soldiers consenting to making themselves dependent on larger impacts. Note, this is also probably what happens when you actually send them on suicide missions, right? Because no one would do that out of their own consideration. You also have to drill soldiers to actually do that. So this is entirely the same. Why are these impacts good? The only response we get from OO is, yeah, and now CO says that as well, yeah, they will die anyway, so this fear will exist anyway. But note, first of all, it's probably not going to be televised, because if you kill yourself swiftly, probably there's just no time for the terrorist organization. Even if there is time, it's going to be not nearly as graphic. We think that in the media, just because of sensationalism or people being horrified by this, there will be much more of an incentive for media to display the graphic images. We think this is terrible for the reasons that my partner has mentioned and haven't really been responded to. Because first of all, these means that the fear is much larger, because now if you think signing up for the army, there will literally be the image of someone burning to death in front of your eyes, rather than an abstract notion of death, which all soldiers know about anyway, right? So we think it becomes just much easier to fight terrorist groups because soldiers will be less afraid to sign up. But secondly, again, we also think that the idea of religious minorities just fighting against an army in a normal military way is going to be much less effective in creating stigmatization than literally seeing them as savages burning people to death. For both of these reasons, we think also for the general picture, please vote OG.
Great, I thank that speaker for those remarks, and I'll call upon the DLO to close that top half. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep, very well.
Cool. Starting in a second. Starting in 3, 2, 1. So a couple of things. One, OG basically never engaged with our practical, and I'll wait later on and explain why this is the case. Two, like OG basically give no framing as to the effectiveness of this scenario, and I'll explain why even when it is not effective, which isn't impossible, this is likely still better for us, but still before that, some rebuttal. Basically what they say is a couple of things. You won't give up intel and other things like this because you won't get tortured and stuff. Like, this isn't 24, right? Torture isn't this end-all be-all giga effective method at receiving intel, because you can just feed them the wrong intel, right? And soldiers are taught this called counterintelligence, and you go through this in the military. These are like, torture is just not very effective at retrieving intel, and they don't like explain this that much. They don't wait. I don't think this should be valued that much as like what intel can do and what it can say. But the second thing they say, I think this is the more interesting one, is but Al-Qaeda will just like take people, it will chop their heads off, and it will flex power like this when the military is captured. A couple of things on this. One, they can do this with not the military, right? They can take journalists, or they can take just random fucking civilians, dress them up as US military, and then kill them. To a large extent, I don't see how this is that big of like a delta. Notice the majority of these kinds of cases are not like, they're not military. Most of the time they are military captures. But notice, even if we accept that there are less people who will be killed in this way, not a lot of people have to be beheaded by a terrorist organizations in order for it to send a message that it is powerful, right? Literally, OG explained this. Doing this just once is very effective at convincing people you are powerful. Even if you get slightly more people to do it with, because people now don't kill themselves, I don't see how this is that big of an impact. But the third piece of rebuttal is, a lot of soldiers won't kill themselves even if the military tells them to. And this is kind of a hot take. Why? For a couple of reasons. One, either they will decide, no, this is not worth it, I cannot go through with this. Two, like they just won't have the opportunity to do this, right? Notice something very important. If this is the case, all of their practical argumentation falls apart, and a large chunk of their principles also fall apart, but all of our argumentation still stands. It is still a principled harm to tell people to do this, and to convince them to do this, and to coerce them into doing this, even if they ultimately don't do it for whatever reason, right? It is still akin to war crimes. Like, if you try to torture someone, but you aren't super good at it, that's still war crimes. But the second reason why this still stands is our practical argumentation is based on signaling. This doesn't have to happen often. It just has to exist as a policy in the army to dissuade people from joining and to dissuade people from combating terrorism, which is very essential because it essentially saves civilians, right? For every terrorist we kill, that is one more likely that like a civilian will be spared and things like this. So even in the case in which these people don't kill themselves, this is still very likely good. This goes to us. Then they tell us, oh, autonomy is only good when a person is rational. This is ridiculous, right? Most people don't make good decisions about themselves, right? But we still give them freedom to do this. Most people probably make wrong decisions. They are coerced by different kinds of things to a large extent, but we still value their autonomy. But they say, oh, but we sometimes take away people when they're mad. Yes. Because notice, those people are no longer themselves because there is an overwhelming coercive force which literally alters their brain chemistry and which prohibits them from having human identity, right? This is not the same. This cannot be equated. Autonomy is still super valuable because why is autonomy valuable? They say, oh, but you don't explain why autonomy is valuable. Why is autonomy valuable? Because essentially personhood and identity derives from autonomy. Your ability to be a person derives from the kind of choices you make as a person, and your value and your identity results from this. Notice, you killing yourself not only removes your autonomy, but like when the state coerces you, you not only remove your autonomy, but when you kill yourself, you abandon your identity. You are totally dehumanized and you accept, I will die and the person that I am no longer matters, but I will solely die for the state. And this thought process, this dehumanization, this is war crimes. This is not fair. Again, dehumanizing people is war crimes. That's why we kind of don't torture them a lot and other things like this. But the other thing they say is, but you cannot imagine physical pain. One, you totally can, right? Like you experience physical pain.
Sorry, you muted yourself. I paused the clock.
Sorry, where did I mute myself?
No worries. You muted yourself just as you said you experience physical pain.
Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Like you experience physical pain. If I hit myself, it hurts and stuff, right? Notice the physical pain you experience from torture is just this, but to a greater degree, right? You are still able to comprehend what it will be like and how this physical pain is likely to play out. But notice, this emotional pain is literally impossible to grasp. You have no idea how this will feel. You have no idea how this thought process will go to because you have never experienced anything close to this. The reason why this is important is you cannot consent to something you cannot imagine. You cannot consent to, oh yes, I'll be totally fine if I get captured, I'll kill myself, because you don't know how this will play out. You don't know how you will feel, but to a large extent, you kind of can imagine how extreme pain feels like. Before I go on, CG, very quickly, please.
Okay, so when you are going as a soldier, you swear allegiance, loyalty, and full commitment to your country. We don't see that like in your speech when you say autonomy. It doesn't exist in the soldier word.
Like, if this were true, it would be okay to torture other soldiers from the military, right? Or it would be okay to do fucking war crimes. Literally by this logic, which is we should optimize amounts of lives or we should optimize what is good for the state, this legitimizes all war crimes. You need to kind of give principled analysis as to why this is the case and not just say we value life over everything else. But the final thing I'm going to rebut from OG is basically say, but torture also assaults human dignity and you being left to be tortured is bad. Well, this is not the case for two reasons. Why torture doesn't assault human dignity? Because while you are experiencing this physical pain, you are still yourself. You still comprehend life from the perspective of your identity, and to a large extent, like you are still not totally dehumanized. But secondly, even if we accept that this is true, the torture does remove human dignity, that's okay, because we are okay with ISIS doing war crimes, but we don't want us to do war crimes, right? As the state that can choose whether it does war crimes. Because like, if they do it, yes, that's awful and that is regrettable, but if we do it, then we take active part in it. If we coerce our people to be dehumanized, then we are the ones who do war crimes. The actor that makes this decision is the state. Even if war crimes happen on either side of the house, we prefer to not be the ones doing them, right? I think this is relatively intuitive, Volto.
Great. I thank that speaker for those remarks, and I thank all speakers on the top half. To open the back half of this debate, I now call upon the member of Gov. Hear, hear.
Okay, cool. Okay, cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Cool. Pano, I'm going to start by like breaking the deadlock which is in the opening half, which is like, is it justifiable if these soldiers are killing themselves? Like, is this something we ought to do? Like, OO is bringing this moral framework why it's like objectively bad for people to kill themselves. There is a difference between like dying as a result of not yourself, but also being killed as you literally. I think we have to understand the subjective moral framework of soldiers and how it's different from the moral framework of another person. I think they have to be a moral framework between like a businessman who wants to get all the benefit and versus someone who already consented to self-sacrifice for the greater good, right? Some reasons why like it's principally just do this, but also why we think from the subjective moral framework of like soldiers, they're willing to do this, right? Understand that I think to the extent that if they are torturing you, there is a high possibility they're able to mine that information from you, right? So this is information which can put many people at risk. This information can destabilize your military bases. This information can make many people die in the first place. I think intuitively, by all analysis, that death is bad and it's something we have to avoid as much as possible. Then I think we ought to prioritize that many people do not die as opposed to one person dying, right? I think if your death can result in saving 100 people's death, I think it's principally just that we can go that way, right? But also I think the other bigger difference is that as a soldier, you already consented to potential death, right? There are different reasons why you can die on the battlefield. You did not say I'm consenting specifically to be killed by someone else. You did not say I consented to be specifically killed by a gun or by like a tank. You consented to possible death within the military, within the combat zone. So already given that you made a concession, I think we ought to prioritize your death over the death of people who did not consent for any possible death within the combat, right? Because if you do not die and you give that information, then we have civilians who are dying and these civilians did not consent at all compared to you who gave some form of consent, right? But let's get into the subjective moral framework of soldiers, because I don't think their framework is the one which always bringing, because if it was true, they would have not become soldiers in the first place. Yes, probably I think, yeah, they never experienced death, but by being soldiers, they understand that it's better to self-sacrifice for the greater good. By becoming soldiers, they understood that it's better if they become handicaps, if they lose their legs, if they lose their head, all the shit which can happen to them, it's better as far as they are serving the greater good, right? And also given that if you are killing yourself, you are doing it for the greater good. I'm not literally seeing the marginal difference between what they consented to do in the first place, which is sacrificing themselves for the greater good, and losing your life also to serve the greater good. I think this is something aligned with the moral framework of soldiers. He talks about identity. I think the identity of soldiers is literally based on like the end justify the means, right? When you become a soldier, you go to difficult training, you wake up all the night, you do all these things. Literally your identity is based on how you're able to protect your motherland, and how you're able to protect your people, right? Which means that if you have a coward death, if you fail to live that mission, that purpose which made you go through all those things, I think you have a metaphorical death. Like even if you literally survive, I think then you don't see yourself the same way you used to see yourself, because you have failed yourself. You failed the very principal thing which made you go through all those very things in the first place, right? But also I think they are able to weight these things over other possible things. Like if you don't die, you have the risk of living with lifelong trauma. You have the risk of being like ostracized in your community, because they know that people died because you could not sacrifice yourself. You did not live up to your mission. I think they're able to see that even if they survive, they do not have the dignity. They will be ostracized by their communities. And through this kind of rationalizing, it makes sense that you choose to have a better death either way. I think also by understanding that you can get tortured and ultimately there's a potential death, right? Not every time like they torture and then they let you go. Given that you are waiting the potential death after giving that information, why not better like accept to die in the first place? Cool. But also let me go to the second thing. Like what is the aim of terrorist groups, right? Understand that they don't just want to win. Like sometimes it is difficult for terrorist groups to win and they know that they are not going to win. That means that their aim, their existence is in creating fear, terrorizing people, like literally like paralyzing people with public fear, right? How do they do this? And how, when we allow soldiers to commit suicide, how do we take this very aim very this goal which they have away from them, right? So literally when you have killed yourself, it is the things which OG said, but then I think they didn't get into their impact, right? So when you take away from them the chance of videotaping your torture, videotaping your rape, we literally take away their possibility to create things of collective trauma. Understand that as a soldier, you consented to seeing these kind of people being killed, you consented to traumatizing experience of war, but your family did not consent for this, your relatives did not consent for this, other people did not consent for this, to the point where they videotaping all those things, and then these videos are publicized to everyone to see them. You are literally traumatizing. Tons and tons of people are going to see these videos. You are traumatizing the mothers, the fathers, the family of these soldiers. You are increasing the harm to the society as a whole, right? But also, what is this other thing we are able to accomplish? Understand that to a point where when they capture you, even if they don't kill you, they capture so they can use you for leverage. And this is one of the very big reasons why it's impossible to crack down terrorist groups in the status quo. When they have taken many soldiers, then they are going to keep threatening the country. If you don't give us this thing, if you don't give us that, we are going to kill your soldiers, right? We think to a point where those soldiers are like they are killing themselves in the first place. We take away this big like leverage of holding these soldiers away from the terrorist groups, which means that terrorist groups, they have less leverage, because having living human beings is literally the biggest leverage which terrorist groups have, and it push most of countries to concede to their demands and make cracking down on them difficult in the first place. We take away this leverage, we win them. But also the last thing of rebuttal, right? Because all say, oh, they can go to civilians in the first place. No, I don't think they will. Why? Because civilians, they do not have the kind of information which terrorists want in the first place. They go to soldiers because soldiers have this secret information. Civilians do not have them. But also, I think when they go to civilians, they're exposing themselves to easy capture. If you're a terrorist group and you are capturing civilians, it means it's easy for the other combatant to even capture, right? But also, I think to the point where civilians can, like terrorists can easily capture civilians, it means your military was defeated in the first place. If they can literally get in the city and start capturing civilians, then like there is no marginal change. Like literally your army has already failed and like consent and get out of the war. For all those reasons, please vote CG.
Great, I thank that speaker for those remarks. And now to open up the CO case, I call upon the member of opposition. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep, very clearly.
Wait, just a second. Yeah. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, all the teams in the debate until now just assumed that captures are going to stay just the same. The number of captures are not going to change. The terrorists are going to do just the same thing, but now they're just going to commit suicide. We think it's a completely wrong and false characterization of what is going to happen. We're going to analyze you why just we get much more soldiers that are captured, and by that we're going to win all the teams in the debate, and all the rebuttal will be integrated in my speech. So let's talk about why we're just getting more soldiers that will be captured by 2 mechanisms. A, why the army will be less accountable and create the precautions measures that they need to do in order to prevent capturing. And secondly, in the terrorist side, why they just have much more incentive to capture soldiers. Let's start with the first mechanism, how the army will be less accountable and create precautious measures. Note, in the status quo, there is really a huge price to for the army to prevent captures. It's afraid of having to do exchange soldiers. It's the responsibility for the life of the soldiers to save them. Therefore, they just create a lot of measures to prevent soldiers from being captured. It's things like having always more than 1 soldiers in a patrol. It's things like giving orders to soldiers how to handle capturing that happens on the ground. Things like you need to chase them into the enemy territories, even though it's not the regular orders. You can fire the terrorists that try to capture, even if you didn't get the order from your commander. It's things like training special units that can actually that know how to handle and bargain with terrorists and how to enter houses where these captured soldiers are in. Why these things are not going to happen when we just tell our soldiers to commit suicide and we try to indoctrinate them to do so? Three reasons. A, because now they just can blame the captures itself. the state and the army can say, we told them to commit suicide. If they decided not to commit suicide, it's really their own choice. If you care about autonomy, which top half cares about, if it's their choice that they didn't commit suicide, now we don't have the responsibility to protect them. We don't need to train units to do that. You don't need to train units to negotiation. We don't need to do these things because it's their blame. Secondly, they just assume that these captures are already dead. You say, okay, we indoctrinated them to commit suicide. They are probably dead. We don't need to chase them into enemy territories. We don't need to start a fire and to stop them, because we just assume that they are going to be dead anyway. We don't need to do this thing in the first place. And thirdly, most important, it's the message they send to the soldiers. They really can send both messages that they need to commit suicide and we need to save capture. We think that just contradict their indoctrinations. For example, they can train units that that will do this negotiation if in the same time tell soldiers, no, we won't save you, don't worry. We think they need to say very clearly to the soldiers the message who don't expect us to save you, because if they'll have even the slightest chance that they will think the army is going to save them, they will not commit suicide. This is not indoctrination. Indoctrination has to be, you have zero chance of being saved. The only way that you can get out of there is commit suicide. Any training or any order that they will do just contradicts this indoctrination, and it's just unlikely to happen. Therefore, we think that all these precautious measures are not going to happen. There will be no orders to chase them. There will be no units that are trained to do so. Therefore, we just think that capturing soldiers is going to be much more likely and much more easy to the terrorists. Now, the second mechanism is why there's just much more incentive for the terrorists to capture them. First of all, need to notice that not all of the soldiers are just suddenly going to commit suicide anyway. Just all the teams just assume that it's going to happen, and the indoctrination is just going to work without any idea why. We think that some probably are going to do so because yes, it's the day, but I think that some, at least some amount of soldiers, maybe a minority, are not going to commit suicide. Why is it true? A, it's really hard for a person to stick a knife in his own belly. We just think that many people will be so afraid of doing so, it will be so hard for them that even if they want to do so, they just will be unable. Secondly, we just think that the people who are the ones who wouldn't commit suicide already are the ones who value life in some manner. They are the ones that they need the indoctrination to do so. They are the ones that value life already, and many of them just won't want to do it, even though the indoctrination. And thirdly, just we think terrorists will do everything to prevent them from doing so because they know they want to commit suicide. Is tie them down 24 hours a day. Is not giving them a knife and fork to eat their food. Is not letting them get outside of their cage because they are afraid they will do something. We think there is already huge impact here, that they have much worse condition and much less autonomy when they are captured. But why it will lead to more capturing soldiers, Both governments agree that terrorists want to make people fear. They want to do immoral to the other country, therefore to have videos of executing soldiers or how they torture them and so on. We think that this incentive still exists. There are still terrorists. They still want to make them afraid. They will do everything to do so. Now, they just need to capture much more soldiers in order to get the same impact. For example, if now to make people fear it, I need to have 2 movies of murdering soldiers. Now I need to capture 2 soldiers in order to commit 2 murders. Now, in order to make 2 movies, if 8 are going, I need 10 soldiers because 8 are going to kill themselves, and only the 2 ones who were unable to do so are the ones that are going to let me have this movie in the first place. Therefore, I just need to capture much more soldiers for the same product. I think that is a huge incentive for these terrorist groups just to capture more soldiers. Before I continue, I'll take top half. Bottom half?
Yeah.
Or the army still have an incentive? Oh.
I didn't hear the question. I just heard army and incentive. I'm sorry. I'll continue. So what if we think is the impact of that? So first of all, we think there's just much more soldiers to be captured, and it's horrible. But I think it's also in a direct clash with Siji's case, because they talked about families suffer when they see this media, these movies. We showed you that not only that it's still going to happen, but there are just more families that their relatives just died without the movie. So now we get also the media that making these families afraid, but also more families that lost their dear ones. The second thing to say is the leverage. Now that terrorists want the leverage in order to try to negotiate. Now, in order for them to negotiate, they need more soldiers. If they want leverage of 10 soldiers to negotiate, now they need to capture 30 soldiers because 20 of them are going to kill themselves. They need to do it more and they will still get the leverage but kill more soldiers. This is the most important thing in the debate because two things. A, practically, more people are dying, more people are getting tortured. This it seems what OG and CG cares about. We just get much more. Secondly, if someone cares about autonomy here in the debate, being captured is the worst thing you can do to one's autonomy. We think it's when showing you to get more soldiers to capture, it's the worst thing in a debate. I beg you to oppose.
I thank that speaker for those remarks, and to close out Gov Bench, call the Gov Whip. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Yep, very clearly.
All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. So my speech will go this way. I will deal first with CO, then go OO, then go OG. One thing that CO neglects totally is that they only take the debate from the perspective of what the terrorist groups should do, but they never care about what the professional army of that country is doing. So any army that respects themselves will take more consideration into raising their security when this kind of things are starting to happen. So we see less incentive of more capturing or more kidnapping, because another point is that these terrorist groups are weaker than this army, and two, if the army should be more professional, and these soldiers are more trained than simple terrorists that are just cowards in random corners of this part of the world. So another thing that on this same point, when you take the comparative in our work where these soldiers are incentivized to kill themselves, so even how these terrorists will know the location, will know when the patrol's time is changing and stuff, if they don't have an inner source for this. So in our case, what you are strengthening the front line and not allowing the terrorist group or minimizing the influx of knowledge of the army side, of the other country side, you are basically limiting the amount of information that they have, basically again limiting the amount of the possibilities of them capturing or doing any kind of act towards this army, right? Cool. So let's go on. Who are the soldiers? My partner explains who are the soldiers, what is their role and impact for the society through their image, through the media, through the global public image that they have, because we believe that soldiers or the army are what every nation is becoming proud of, is what every nation is being secure with. So when you are basically why we want you to support this motion is because when you are putting this army into danger, when you are humiliating this army, when you are putting them to speak with you in the table, for example, for exchange of captured people, of hostages, of your soldiers and stuff, you're basically putting their value down. How was that? I will be explaining. So the thing is that, look, basically what my partner explained was that he gave you more framework of soldiers. What does that mean when it clashes with OO? It means that one, torture is inefficient. That's what OO says. We think that torture is efficient enough because there are a lot of chemicals that you can use to make anybody say the truth, because at the end you can drug them or anything. But two, when you take the consent, my partner clearly explains how the consent is already done when you decide as an individual to integrate the army or you go as a soldier, because there is one potential death that can happen at any time, but two, when you are going to be kidnapped and something like that, it is your moral duty to first, before thinking about yourself as individual and thinking whether you want to die or not, you need to think about your nation, you need to think about people you left behind, your family, people you love, and what can happen if these people can get any information through use of drug or anything that can happen if you lose control over yourself as a soldier and information is leaked. Cool. They decide not to do all the opportunity. So on the I decide on not to do, the soldiers will do if you indoctrinate them the right way, and that was explained. The opportunity, it's easy to kill yourself if you want to. Hold your breath, bite your tongue, anything that you can do to die, it's feasible. Autonomy. Basically, we don't get that point, but we still think that the moment you integrate an army, and what is the difference between you and doing crime wars is basically your autonomy is lost as long as you are defending the people, as long as you are defending or making immune the front line of your army. So for all of these reasons, we think that there is a huge difference between committing war crimes and just dying or making a suicide that will save a lot of people. For religion will send you to paradise if you save 100 people. That's short for all religions, right? So the second point that my partner mentions clearly is that using captives to create public trauma and humiliation, therefore traumatizing civilians who didn't consent to harms of war, right? So what does that mean? So basically, imagine a soldier just being captured, and the amount we explained to you why there is higher potential or higher possibility for the soldiers to leak information. Even minimal information will just create a butterfly effect that will end up hurting the people or hurting the army, right? So on that point, we think that like we're making the difference with OG, but we are also like making the difference with OO and showing how their probability or like how these things work are not working. Because when you are basically like my partner explains clearly that these terrorist groups are only after the psychological harm and the psychological fear and terror that they are creating on these countries. So basically like the incentive that they are creating is to make it as public as possible. When you suicide, you don't allow them to make this public because like there is no hostage. Even if they take fake hostages, now the government has full capability of just like denying that and showing the images of this these martyrs or the soldiers that died to serve the country. They show them as martyrs, as heroes of the nation, thing that does not exist on the other side. What does that mean when you show them as heroes of the nation? It develops the nationalism, it develops like, you know, this moral immunity of the people and their belief in their army and stuff and their feeling of security, which is the biggest impact that we're imposing to you as opposing government in this emotion. Before moving on, do you have anything? Closing?
Yeah. How indoctrination can affect any soldiers when the army prepares to save captured soldiers by training special units and give them special orders?
Look, you should have mechanized that, but the thing is that, look, when you are incentivized, like as a soldier, when you are captured, you don't care about what is going to happen. You just see living in the status quo in the here and now. You see that these people are going to use a drug on you that make you say all the truth. So before the army that you are like trusted in and stuff like that will come to save you, you will already have leaked a lot of information. Plus, like where this happens is that these terrorist groups have hideways. They hide. There is a lot of places that the army cannot reach easily or something like that. So there is no security where you can be when you can be saved or not. You will be just like given more opportunity for the terrorist groups. So cool. What do you get from our side basically, and why we should win this debate? Maybe like we tell you that as a soldier, maybe your body will not go back to your homeland even, but as a glory, as a role model, as a figure, you will be always commemorated for infinity as a martyr that have the moral principle or like, you know, the moral motivation that gives to your people, but to your army, both physical security and moral security and immunity and confidence that these terrorist groups are nothing but cowards that do not have anything, that we don't risk anything by their acts or something like that because we have heroes having our backs. So 3 basic impacts that you got. You cut info when you suicide. You cut info taking possibility from to the terrorist group. You fortify the immunity of society towards the coward terrorist groups as like being a martyr, like commemoration and all of that, but also the social image and the spirit of fight that you raise by your act of suicide. You do your job in keeping first line strong and immune, so you have in combating terrorism by the ways that my partner has mentioned, by not leaking info, and when you don't allow the public bargain and giving value to these groups. For all of these reasons, proud to propose.
Great, I thank that speaker for those remarks. And now to close out this debate, I call upon the opposition with here.
Am I audible?
Yep, very clearly.
Great. I will begin in 3, 2, 1. Look, panel, we think there are 2 questions in this debate. The first is a question of autonomy, and the second is a question of societal harms. Before I begin, I want to point out exactly the amount of engagement we got with our case from CG, okay? Because Lior gives 2 mechanisms for why we actually get people, 3 mechanisms for why we get people who are kidnapped more often on our side. He says that A, there is less accountability on the army. He says this for multiple reasons that go completely unanswered by CO. He says that we're getting less training within the army in order to get these people outside because the assumption is that they will commit suicide. 0 answers from CG, sorry. And third, he's saying that we're actually getting more, we're incentivizing these terrorist groups to kidnap more people because they needed to kidnap more people in order to get the same amount of leverage that they had yesterday. We think that all of this together combined leads to just more people being kidnapped on the whole. What answer do we get? We say that terrorist groups are weaker and soldiers are better at protecting themselves. We think that this is just true on either side of the debate, and it's on either side of the debate, and it's also just not taking into account that terrorist groups aren't always that weak and that they do succeed at these things sometimes, and they specifically train for this because the leverage is super important to them. But second, he says any self-respecting army will do things. Look, we're not saying that the army wants these people to be kidnapped. We're just saying that they're going to put significantly less resources and significantly less accountability, which means on the whole, we're not going to have them like not care about people being kidnapped and captured at all. We just think that they are going to do that significantly less, which will lead to, on the whole, more people being captured. And we think that that is just the nuance there of exactly how much it's happening. We think that given those minimal responses to our case, you have to buy all of Lior's analysis on why we're just getting significantly more people captured. Let's talk about what impact this has on autonomy, and this is the first class. This is what happens in first house, basically. Most of the analysis is at the point of capture and whether or not people can consent to that fact. OG say that at the point that they are captured, at that point, it is better for us to take people's decision away. Notice that we think our answer to this is that the best way to preserve a person's autonomy is to prevent them from having to make this impossible decision in the first place. And while we think that soldiers may be able to consent to this, on the whole, if autonomy is important to us, we want to prevent this from happening. The fact that someone can consent doesn't mean that it is a good outcome. Soldiers can also consent to dying, but on the whole, we prefer that they don't die. Soldiers can consent to being burned alive, maybe, but we prefer that they don't be burned alive, and we still have we just think it's just morally better if they don't do that. We think that is the best way to preserve their autonomy, and we want to prevent them having to make this decision in the first place. We think that that is a better explanation for why we get more autonomy than what OO get, right? Because OO also question this matter of consent and whether or not they can consent or not consent. We think that OG give ample analysis on why it is that they actually can consent to this, and it's no different from anything else that they are consenting to in extent of dehumanization or extent of pain or things like that. But our answer to that is that it's just more important that we preserve it and prevent the situation from happening in the first place. What does CG have to say on autonomy, right? CG have to say on autonomy two things. Well, one thing. The first is that there's the autonomy of the other people that this may traumatize, right? The families and people who are going to be watching the videos of people being executed. We think that our answer to this is that most people can decide whether or not they want to watch these videos. This isn't televised on the news because people don't want to be traumatized. This is on social media now, like blacks this out. It means you have to actually opt in to watching these videos and to being traumatized by this. We don't think that that is an extent of consent, but when we're comparing that to the families who don't get to choose whether they want to mourn or not, but at the point at which their family member is kidnapped and they know that they have had to commit suicide and they have to mourn this person not coming back, those families have much less choice and much less autonomy than the people who choose to watch videos and to read the news about the war and what is actively going on. We think, therefore, that if we're looking at where we're preserving autonomy more, we think we're preserving more autonomy when less people have to mourn because we're getting less people kidnapped at the end of the day. Lastly, and that's what we have to say on autonomy. So we preserve more autonomy on the whole. We get less people in a situation in which they have to make these decisions in the first place, and we get less people who didn't consent actively mourning and having to do these things. This is why we win on that clash. Now let's talk about societal harms, but before that, I will take OG.
Yes. Currently, soldiers wear a bulletproof vest. By your logic, if they didn't do that and they got shot and killed, there would be no accountability. So why do they do it?
No, we just think that there is more accountability when the army has to go in and try to save these people as opposed to if they commit suicide. Again, we're not saying that they're not going to take any steps, but we're not going to have like the specific units that we have today that go out and try to save these people and try to prevent captures. And we don't have the specific as in-depth training because there is less of a reason to put in those resources and those money into that because the people, there is less of a risk on the other side. Let's talk about societal harms, right? Because here's what we get from CG. The first is we get that torture videos and execution can demoralize people. Here's what happens to this. Basically answer this by saying you don't need human beings you don't need actually military people, you can have citizens. Where do we come in? We think that we show that you don't even need to do that in order to demoralize people, and you can demoralize people just by kidnapping more people, right? And now that we're kidnapping people who don't stay alive, we think that these terrorist groups have an active incentive to kidnap the most people they can as possible in order to cause the same amount of demoralization. So we think that we're just getting more people demoralized on our side because they kidnap more people at the end of the day. But then they tell us that we're still going to get intelligence out of people. We think that OO answered quite well why it is that we're not necessarily getting good information out of torture. But what we tell you is that the other reason, and CG agree with this, that people still kidnap people, because not getting information out of torture is true in both worlds. We think that the real reason these terrorist groups kidnap people is because it ties into their goal of demoralizing and causing harm to citizens at the end of the day. We think that is why they continue to kidnap people, even though there is no terrorism. That bottom line is newly brought to you by Lior, and we think that that is the real harm of incentivizing them to kidnap more and more people, because that is what causes more demoralization at the end of the day. So we don't think they are actually getting information out of this, out of torture or all of the other things. They are actually using this as leverage and to try to demoralize. That is when we actually have to answer leverage, right? So we just think that they still hope to get leverage. When Lior explains to you why most people aren't necessarily going to commit suicide, it just goes to show that they are still going to get this leverage at the end of the day, except instead of kidnapping 2 people to get this leverage, they're going to kidnap 20 so that they end up with 2 live soldiers that they can get this leverage with. So we are both causing more societal harm by having more people mourn and more people mourn their dead and more people dead, and also just getting the same amount of leverage for that at the end of the day. What do we show you at the end of the day? That we're just getting more people kidnapped with the same amount of impacts and larger impacts, and that's what I'm supposed to do. Please vote CO.
Great, I thank that speaker for those remarks, and I thank all speakers for what was a fine debate. I invite all speakers to exit the Zoom call. We will deliberate, and at some point in the Discord, probably at the same time as the grand final, but don't quote me on that as I'm not a CA, they will announce the results of the final.
Thank you very much.
All teams.
Thank you very much for this round.
Bye.
Thank you.